Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new disaster film, Twisters. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So June and July typically mark like the end of the peak tornado season in America, but in Hollywood it is just beginning because Twisters is blowing into theaters 28 years after kind of the 1996 kind of cult classic hit film Twister, and despite being framed as like kind of a sequel, a follow-up to that original film, Twisters is probably better thought of as like a reimagining or a reboot rather than a direct sequel, because really you don't need to have any prior knowledge to that first film in order to be engaged and immerse yourself in this film. And there really is no like kind of narrative continuation beyond just a shared template of tornadoes and storm chasers. And just personally, I've always felt like there's something very like quintessentially Hollywood about disaster flicks where, heroic human struggles play out against the backdrop of just, mass visual spectacle. Although the genre seems to have kind of waned in popularity in recent years, we just don't get as many of these as we used to back like in the 90s when, it seemed like we got a bunch of these every summer. Although Twisters may change the winds on that trend because this is a good movie. I really enjoyed this movie. Again, I'm the target audience for this. I'm a sucker for disaster films. But I think there is just a lot to appreciate with Twisters. I think kind of having two very charismatic leads, a lot of this immersive, impressive disaster spectacle, and enough like engaging human drama to ground the narrative that kind of gives Twisters everything it needs to be an entertaining summer blockbuster. And in a recent interview, director Lee Isaac Chung made an interesting statement where he said Twisters is not just a disaster movie, it's a monster movie. And I've always felt like those two genres, they've just always been kind of overlapped, kind of both showcasing humanity's noble struggle for survival against the daunting and like overpowering forces of nature. And kind of another similarity between those two genres is that kind of both have two crucial elements that they need to be successful. The first is that the monster or the disaster must be exciting, and the second one is that the characters just need to be sympathetic and easy to root for. And thankfully, I think Twisters understood the assignment on both fronts. But let's start with the spectacle, because hey, let's be honest, that's why we go to these types of movies. And speaking as someone who has, on more than one occasion gone down the YouTube rabbit hole of just watching, tornado videos into the wee hours of the night, there is this something undeniably like sublime and like awe-inspiring about tornadoes. And I think Twisters is the type of movie that just seems made to be experienced through the giant, the biggest possible movie theater screen and, the movie theater sound system. Really is like the camera thrusts the audience like right into the middle of these, big forces of nature. And while I don't think every tornado encounter in this film is always like edge of your seat thrilling, they are consistently entertaining, and there is enough like variation in like how those sequences are framed to keep things interesting. But while the Twisters are clearly the main event, storms need chasers, and it really is the human characters that often like make or break a disaster film. And director Chung is best known to this point for his kind of emotional, character-driven drama Minyari, for which he earned 2 Academy Award nominations. So he might initially seem like this an odd choice to helm a very big budget, spectacle-driven blockbuster, but I think his more like grounded storytelling sensibilities become one of this film's greatest assets, because while the Twisters are rightfully, I think, given the spotlight, Chung never loses sight of kind of the essential human component. The movie is also elevated by a solid cast, particularly featuring, the very earnest performance from Daisy Edgar-Jones, as well as the irresistible charisma of Glenn Powell. And Jones is given kind of most of the heavy lifting as far as like the emotional story beats go, as a character that is just struggling to overcome grief and face her fears, where Powell, on the other hand, is kind of left to provide more of like the levity and just the fun elements to the story that could have otherwise veered into like overly serious territory. I think the supporting cast too, they're all good, if perhaps I think a bit underused, really with none of the characters feeling like they're there just for mere like tornado fodder. And one of the challenges, just like tonally for these types of movies, is that they must strike a very delicate balance between kind of treating the natural disasters with a respectful reverence without putting a damper just on the the pulpy fun. Twisters, I think, strikes the balance well for the most part, although its commitment more to like the more serious side of the story sometimes does pump the brakes a little bit on just sort of the summer blockbuster fun. Because this movie kind of repeatedly reminds audiences about the more somber consequences of the devastation of these, natural disasters. And obviously, that is not a bad thing at all, and I do think it effectively instills like a sense of stakes into the action, but it can sometimes be a buzzkill or just at least work kind of in tension with the more like lighthearted fun moments, since there's a lot of the scenes featuring Glenn Powell. But even so, I do think this movie manages to kind of entertain audiences without ever cheapening like the reality of the true natural disasters and just like the value of life. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, there's really not a whole lot. Probably the most comes in profanity, where I think I counted probably between 10 to 15 kind of minor profanities, words beginning with S and A and D and H, as well as several uses of God or Lord in vain, and one or two kind of crude insults. Sexuality, there's nothing here unless you consider Glenn Powell walking through the rain in a wet t-shirt, but again, nothing really to be concerned about as far as that. Violence, there is, as expected, plenty of devastation and death, although none of it is really depicted any kind of graphic way on screen. You see characters like pulled up into the air from the tornado or hit with the debris, and presumably they are killed as a result, but their bodies are never shown. You never sort of see the death on screen. So as far as themes, kind of messages, things going on beneath the surface of this, prior to the film's release, director Chung stated that he intentionally kind of made the choice to avoid using the words, like climate change, since he didn't want the film to come across as preachy in a way that might, distract from like the entertainment value that it had to offer. And viewers can likely still like read between the lines with what's being said to discern some of that subtext, going on in this film. But for the most part, this film does explore, I think, kind of other and even more spiritual themes. And the value of a lot of these like disaster films is that they do kind of showcases the overwhelming power, and glory of nature without any of the real world consequences. And director Chung actually comes from a religious background, grew up kind of in and out of the church, and he had described his earlier film Manyari as sort of the theme of wrestling with God. I think religion plays a much like less obvious role in Twisters, but I do think a similar theme can be found. And there's an interesting early moment where Tyler, who is Glenn Powell's character, is kind of explaining the allure of tornadoes. And kind of what intrigues him most is that there's just so much that we don't understand about them. And then he remarks that they are part science, part religion. And it kind of builds on that premise at the end of the film, because the climax of this, it takes place in a movie theater. And it's just a really expertly, I think, constructed scene set in this retro movie theater that is playing 1931's Frankenstein. And all of a sudden, like, the back wall and the movie screen are kind of like violently swept away, pulled away, providing like a frame for the characters to look out, outside and see the approaching tornado. And just sort of that transition from the characters watching Frankenstein to watching this tornado approach just suggests that there is some intended like link between the two. And obviously, I think one possible interpretation is just sort of the unmentioned climate change message and the idea that like, our technological advancement has created this deadly monster, which in the film would be sort of increased tornado activity. But I think other meanings can also be inferred because a central theme in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein novel is this idea of human ego that kind of overreaches and attempts to harness and control kind of forces that only God has the power over. And I think from that perspective, it is sort of a reminder that for all the scientific jargon that gets, tossed around by the characters in this film, sort of the swirling tornadoes and just sort of creation, the power of creation remains an act of God. So overall, I think Twisters is a disaster movie done right, balancing meaningful drama with exciting spectacle. It's the kind of movie that just demands to be seen on the biggest screen possible. I think it's a film that is skillfully crafted to entertain, but on a deeper level, it's also a timely reminder that no matter how technologically advanced we have become, we remain fearfully small and powerless against just the might and glory of God's sublime creation. But hey, would love to hear what you think. If you check out this movie, if you enjoyed it as much as I did, if you're just a sucker for these types of disaster movies, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about this. If you haven't done so, to encourage you guys, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider, because that's of movie reviews and a podcast and interviews and just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through a world for Christ.